Welcome to today's hearing of the Parliament of South Australia's Joint Committee on the Establishment of Adelaide University. My name's Dan Cregan, I'm the presiding member. To my right is Lucy Hood, member for Adelaide, Sarah Andrews, member for Kingston. To my left, members of the Upper House, the Honourable Reggie Martin and the Honourable Jing Lee. Mr. Honeywood, do you have an opening statement that you would wish to give to the committee?
It's a statement that I haven't prepared as such, but I'm more than happy to explain where my association is coming from and I guess my views before opening up the question. So I think you've got pros and cons here, Mr. Chairman. One of the cons would have to be that we heard from the current head of the Prime Minister's Department, Professor Glenn Davis, at the National Regulators Conference late last year, that Australia's universities are, according to any global standard, very large institutions where there's no appetite politically to create new universities, public universities, and the future of higher education may well involve smaller, more nimble teaching-only institutions, may involve course-specific institutions. And this was an interesting perspective from, of course, the former University of Melbourne Vice-Chancellor prior to him becoming current head of the Prime Minister's Department. So I think we need to, in any merger proposition, we need to factor in that Australia's universities are already regarded as very large according to international standards. And my main concern, the concern of my association, would be the extent to which all students, international and domestic, don't get lost in the proverbial woodwork in a much larger institution. However, the pro, in consultation with many university colleagues, would be obviously that you would probably have a greater range of courses, particularly the postgraduate area. You'd have more flexibility, more of a menu of choices, if you like, for international postgrad researchers. You'd also have probably enhanced employability options for international students, in particular, given that the University of South Australia has had a very strong employability focus as part of its university mission, and this would have to be a good thing for all international students, I would assume, in the larger institution. In terms of the economic benefits to the South Australian economy, if you've got a much larger institution that has got that additional range of courses, the higher global rankings that would accrue to a group of 8 university with added enrolments and added courses, then this could lead to a greater interest, shall we say, from the international students in enrolling in that particular institution. My closing comment there would be that I think we really would have to make sure in any merger going ahead that student services became core business. Too often in the past, many of our public universities, particularly our private providers as well, have regarded many student services such as mental health counselling, which is a growing concern for many domestic and international students, regarded employment agencies, referrals, regarded accommodation as ancillary, and increasingly both domestic and international students want to see that as fundamental to the university's mission. And so I think we just have to be careful that in the short term, any such merger, Chair, would be potentially negative, because in the short term it would take some time, obviously, for these various services to be merged and to really, if you like, guarantee that these student services I've mentioned were genuine core business rather than ancillary services. So I think in the medium to longer term that could all be worked out, but my association would be particularly keen to see what caveats are put in place by your committee and in the recommendation that you make regarding the bona fide services that we would want a large institution to guarantee access to all students for.
Thank you, Mr. Honeywood. We have been joined as well by Mr. Michael Brown, member for Florey, and the Honourable John Gardner, member for Morialta. Questions from members? Honourable Reggie Martin. Thanks for coming today. Can you just give us a bit of a brief about your organisation and who you represent?
Sorry, apologies, I should have done that at the outset. So, myself personally, I'm the former Minister in Victorian Government for Higher Education Training and Multicultural Affairs, and left Parliament in 2006, and I've been the CEO of the International Education Association of Australia since 2011. And my association, if you like, is the peak of the peak bodies. Our members include all public universities, quality private providers, public TAFE, government high schools, private high schools, English language colleges, basically any provider that is involved in recruiting international students, bringing them to Australia, and of course we also do learning abroad where Australian students increasingly go offshore, and we also are involved in student accommodation and the Council of International Students Association in a mentoring role as well. So we do a lot of professional development, a lot of research, and a lot of lobbying on behalf of the international education sector.
Thank you. And in the time that you've been in your role, have you been familiar with any mergers of any universities? And if you have, what's your view of them been?
No, there's been no mergers. I think South Australia's the first cab off the rank in that regard. We're obviously looking in WA at the potential for a merger there between these two universities. But my understanding is that came off the back of the South Australian government's initiative. WA's followed chronologically behind what you're doing, but there's been no mergers. I mean, there was a merger, with Central Queensland University and a large Queensland TAFE institution, but that was more about creating a dual sector institution rather than university to university.
And in your opening statement, you talked about a larger institution might be more likely to, might be paraphrasing you, it might be more likely to sustain a high global ranking?
Correct. That would obviously depend on the quality of the academics that have merged into the larger entity, but given that University of South Australia specifically has got a range of courses that are quite different from the profile of University of Adelaide, you would hope that the rankings would, if you like, if they average out, whatever, that they would increase the new institution's profile globally.
And that's something that just generally comes about with increasing in scale in universities. The more academics, the more research published, the higher the...
Well, not necessarily, but more likely than not.
Thank you. Florey.
Mr. Honeywood, you talked in your opening statement about, and again I'm paraphrasing you now, but I think you said that one of the most important risks you saw in this possible process was the loss of student services, potential loss of student services. Given that the two vice chancellors have issued a statement saying that they intend to have basically a student-centric approach with the new university, does that give you any comfort as to how the new university might go? And also, is it just simply a matter of the two vice chancellors doing what they say, and then the whole thing will work from your perspective?
Look, I know Peter Hoyer and I know David Lloyd quite well. It's wonderful that they see student services as core business, as I put it, but whether either of those individuals will be around for very long post-merger is obviously problematic, and I think the committee would do well to recommend that whoever is the incoming Vice-Chancellor, the Governing Council, the Head of Student Services at Deputy Vice-Chancellor level, whatever, that they are true to those prior commitments.
So you believe that ensuring those student services can go forward, in order to make that happen, it would simply be a matter of this committee making recommendations to make sure that the proper structures are in place for the university?
I would hope so. I know when I was Minister for Higher Education in Victoria under the Kennett government, we agreed to establish University of Melbourne Private, and I was concerned about that new, if you like, private adjunct to University of Melbourne. So I put into my requirements as Minister that there would automatically be an audit 1 year after that new entity was created of a range of issues, including student services, an independent audit to ensure that the mission that had been agreed upon at the time of the establishment of that new institution that was owned by University of Melbourne, if you like, that an automatic audit would have to happen to ensure that the commitments given had been delivered upon. So that would be one, I guess, option open to the committee to suggest that an independent audit take place either 1 year, 18 months, 2 years, automatically after the merger.
So it's your experience as a minister being involved in essentially the creation of new universities that things such as audits after a brief period of time help put the pressure, as it were, on the new university to make sure they do what they're supposed to do, and they have been quite successful?
That was my experience with the University of Melbourne some years ago. I mean, it was a different arrangement to what you're looking at. You're looking at the merger of two public institutions. This was an attempt by a public university to have a separate institution created that was teach only, if you like, didn't have a research arm, and I had concerns about that. So as Minister, I intervened in the process and said I would require an audit to ensure that the loan authorities had been delivered upon.
So it's just one more question, sorry, Mr. Chair. But so is your experience that such devices as mandated audits help mitigate risk in these sort of things?
Absolutely. They also help the politicians to say that we've tried to make sure that something's been done objectively and that people are held to account for commitments that were given. So, yeah, I would argue that there'd be no downside to the committee putting that measure forward.
Thank you.
Further questions from members?
Thank you, Mr. Honeywood. When you were talking earlier about the provision of student services, you raised accommodation as being one of those. We heard evidence last week that Adelaide is well placed to meet the demand of accommodation for students and particularly international students. Is that also your understanding of how Adelaide's placed?
Well, going forward, it's going to depend largely on the planning policy frameworks that the South Australian Government and the various local government entities put in place. My strong belief is that Adelaide is the only true university city in Australia where you can walk down North Terrace and you've got the two current large institutions bookended at either end of the street. You've got your public infrastructure in the middle, your museum, your library, Parliament House itself, and you've got Flinders University establishing a very strong CBD campus in the middle of North Terrace. So it's a wonderful, welcoming university city, which international students. I mean, if you look at the data, you'll see that in any 1 year, South Australia often has almost double the number of full fee-paying international students that Western Australia has. And one of the issues faced by a number of other capital cities is that their universities' campuses are spread out, if you like, in the outer suburbs, particularly Perth is an example of that. And so they don't have the incredible CBD footprint or campus presence that you have in Adelaide. Now, as we know, developers of either independent student accommodation in the purpose-built student accommodation sector, the Escapes, your uni lodges, your igloos, those sort of companies are largely owned by overseas pension funds, and their appetite to build more purpose-built student accommodation is often predicated on being in a CBD location. So I think to the extent that the Parliament of South Australia, the City of Adelaide are willing to support planning changes that are conducive to more purpose-built student accommodation, then yes, Adelaide has got a great future for meeting student demand with accommodation. Having said that, of course, at the moment, we've got a large number of students looking for accommodation in cities like Adelaide, Sydney and Brisbane, and that's a short-term issue that hopefully we can overcome.
And for Adelaide.
Thanks, Mr. Honeywood. My question is around competition. You'd probably be aware of the competition between states for international students. By establishing this new university, by looking at marketing South Australia, can you talk to the benefit that would give us an edge in South Australia, given the competitive nature of this industry?
Look, it's a great question. I guess in reference to my previous answer that University of Adelaide, the City of Adelaide and the State of South Australia punch way above their weight in international education. You're also well served by Study Adelaide, who over many years have done incredible collegiate marketing of international education into your state. I know the current CEO, Jane Johnston, very well. She sits with me on the National Council for International Education, which is the only one of its type in the world, where you've got 7 federal ministers, each of whom's got portfolio responsibility, be it immigration, be it Austrade, etc. And you've also got 11 non-ministerial expert members, and the CEO of Study Adelaide is one of those 11 expert members with myself. So I'm well aware of how nimble, on a small budget, Study Adelaide is able to promote South Australia as a top study destination for international students. And as I said in my opening statement, it really comes down to ensuring that the larger institution, rather than dropping courses that international students would want to enrol in, actually enhances its teaching profile, enhances its research profile, if you like, takes the best of University of South Australia and the best of University of Adelaide in terms of meeting demand for courses and for postgraduate research, and it's up to them to then ensure that the marketing done either by themselves as one new institution or Study Adelaide as an entity on their behalf is able to really hit the ground running.
Further questions?
Chair, I have just 2 questions.
Honourable Connie Benares.
Thank you, Mr. Honeywood. Can I just start by asking you this? There's been evidence so far during this committee about the risk of losing reputational naming because of the new renaming of the proposed university. And at the same time, there's also been evidence before the committee that, overcoming current bureaucratic processes, having that streamlined approach, the quality of output from a new university ought to be enough to alleviate any risk associated potentially with renaming a university. And I'm just wondering from where you sit, particularly in terms of research areas where I think we've been told, sometimes our researchers have to tell people where South Australia is, let alone where Adelaide is. So do you think that is a risk that is easily overcome if the quality of the output and all those other things that I mentioned are addressed as part of a merger? Does that put us on a better global international stage?
Look, on balance, I think it does, because you've retained the name Adelaide, as I understand it, in the proposed merger entity name, and all of the marketing of international education in Australia is very strongly based on the capital city. So, when we promote, I'm on the board of Study New South Wales, for example, with I live in Melbourne, and when we promote New South Wales, it's much easier to promote Sydney. Now that kind of causes pain and suffering to Newcastle and Wollongong, but in the case of South Australia, you're unlikely to be promoting come and study in Port Augusta or Port Lincoln or some of those smaller regional towns. Your promotion of your state as a great, welcoming, multicultural study destination is really going to always be around Adelaide. And if the name of the combined institution reflects that destination, then I think that any other concerns can easily be overcome. I think conversely, if you'd decided to go with the name of South Australia University or retain the name of University of South Australia, to your point, that's a more difficult sell. But Adelaide's well established. It's had any number of international students over many years, intergenerational. Colombo Plan students, graduates who are now politicians and industry leaders and academics all over Southeast Asia. So I'm less concerned if you keep the name Adelaide in the new institution than otherwise.
Thank you. And just finally, and you referred to this in your outcome in your opening about the nimble approach that we're likely to be seeing as recommended. And I just wondered if you could comment on the Accord review more generally. Do you think that this is something that could continue, regardless of the fact that we have now on the cards the outcome of that Accord review, and regardless of the fact that, you know, across the board, it might be recommending smaller universities or teaching hubs and a more nimble approach to university life more generally? Do you think they can coexist?
Look, it's an interesting perspective. I know my old friend Warren Bebbington, Professor Warren Bebbington, former Vice-Chancellor, has raised the issue of the Accord, you know, potentially requiring some deferral. I guess I'm more optimistic than that. I mean, the Federal Minister's already announced some of the key issues to come out of the Accord. He's now relying on, I guess, some sort of collegiate agreement to 70 spiky ideas, but I'm on the Accord reference panel to the Minister, and I'd have to say that a lot of those spiky ideas won't see the light of day anyway. Yeah, I think the timeline is okay to proceed, given that the Accord discussion paper's out in the marketplace and given that the Minister's already flagged some of the key recommendations that he's willing to accept.
Thank you very much.
Member for Moralta.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Honeywood. In your comments, you talked about the need for some of the short-term costs to ensure the success of the proposal if it's to go ahead. I think you particularly talked about student services needing to become more core business than they have been for universities. But could I ask you to expand on what short-term costs you're talking about? I'm thinking in the context of areas that will be critical for priority investment for the new institution for it to be set up for success if it's to proceed.
Look, it's a really good question. I'm envisaging that in the lead up to the actual merger, there'd be agreement on, for example, who was going to lead the student accommodation area. For example, you may not be aware that and I'm not advocating any individual here, but the current head of student accommodation at University of Adelaide is the long-standing chair of the Student Accommodation Association, which has been doing great things in the international and domestic student space nationally to make student accommodation core business. So Adelaide's already got, or South Australia's already got some key players in some of these student service areas, and that's just one example. I won't name that individual, but he's recognised nationally as leading a lot of the student accommodation agenda issues. So I mentioned that as one example where it would be really important, I think, to have a range of committees or working groups that bring together the relevant specialist staff, professional staff, academics involved in student services to ensure that when the merger happens, to use my previous terminology, the new institution can hit the ground running, and hopefully those working groups on, say, mental health counselling, student accommodation, employment and employability, or employment referral, you want to call it that, just to name three key student services. Hopefully, in the lead up to the actual new institution starting, you would have budget allocations that have been agreed upon, and as I said, key point being you'd want the agreed upon leadership teams in each of those areas to take the new institution forward. So my plea to the committee is that you would recommend a lead time with a range of specialist working groups so that things didn't fall through the cracks, shall we say, when the new institution was actually starting operation.
Thank you. On a slightly different note, a number of the witnesses that we've heard from have talked about the priorities for a university, or perhaps the purposes of a university. What makes a university a good university, what makes a university a successful university. If I can summarise about half a dozen witnesses, there's this tension that some believe exists between a focus on research and a focus on student experience outcome or vocational outcomes. If it could be summarised as glibly as saying that some people say that University of South Australia is an excellent teaching university and University of Adelaide is an excellent research university, and the proposal seeks to have a university that will be world leading in both. Pardon me. What's your views on whether or not there is a tension there that can be easily resolved or readily resolved, or whether most universities tend to benefit from focusing on one outcome or the other? What are the key purposes, I guess, that of a university, and can both be achieved?
Look, I'm hopeful that with a great deal of goodwill and with the right leadership team in place, the best of University of South Australia's, if you like, industry technology focus can be combined with the best of University of Adelaide's research profile. But again, it really comes down to leadership, doesn't it, of an institution, and we can't predict how that's going to pan out. Various universities in South Australia have had outstanding leaders, and they've had other leadership issues in over a number of years that haven't done too well, shall we say, without going into detail. So it really comes down to who's appointed as Vice-Chancellor, who's appointed as Provost, and to my point earlier, it comes down to those working groups or, I guess, merged committees of the best and the brightest from the two institutions, making sure that all of the homework's done, if you like, to put the best of each institution in place. Having said that, of course, we can't overlook the fact that Flinders University may well find that this merger suits its own mission. I mean, Flinders University got outstanding teaching delivery in the outer suburbs of Adelaide. Flinders University is well known globally for its allied health research and work in allied health. So, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that the merged institution will cause the third university in South Australia, if you like, to be disadvantaged. In fact, I can see there'd be advantages for Flinders University as well, in able to really focus on a separate mission or a different pathway mission compared to the larger entity.
To put my cards on the table, one of the things that's given me pause before giving the proposal my early support is whether or not the risks of the proposal are understood such that a risk mitigation plan can be put in place. You've mentioned one aspect. This is dependent, the good outcomes are dependent on good leadership, and a few people have said that. So obviously people have confidence in the current leadership of the institutions, but continuation of good leadership is a potential risk. We've got the Vice-Chancellors and the Chancellors tomorrow, and obviously I'll be asking them about risks. Are there any other key risks to the institution achieving the outcomes that it seeks to that you would identify that need to be mitigated against?
Look, some of the key risks are actually endemic across the whole of Australia at the moment. So, for example, speaking to co-convener of the Federal Government's Council for International Education, I can tell you that the policy frameworks are not helping public universities. We've got a lot of poaching of international students from public universities into, shall we say, less than high-quality private colleges and vocational colleges. That's a national policy problem we're trying to come to terms with. We've got a crazy pandemic recovery visa at the moment that's encouraged over 100,000 full fee paying international students to drop out of their student visa into a full-time work visa. So hopefully some of these are short-term policy issues that can be resolved, but some of them have been around for many years. So I think it's important that your committee actually looks at some of the national policy framework challenges and how they're likely to pan out that might support the combined institution rather than if the two institutions stayed separate. In that regard too, 80% of the full fee paying international students who come to Australia come on the recommendation of a overseas-based education agent. Australia is far more reliant than New Zealand, Canada, USA and UK on education agents to refer students to a particular city or a particular country. And so again, I think that practical issue needs to be factored in, that University of South Australia would in many cases have different education agents to University of Adelaide, and the extent to which, again, the preparatory work's done to ensure that the education agents who are relied upon to refer international students to Adelaide or to South Australia are very carefully informed about the benefits of the merged institution and are educated, if you like, to understand that the new institution will hit the ground running and is really committed to ensuring the best education outcome to any international student that is referred by any education agent, be it in the Punjab in India or be it in China, etc.
Thank you. One key final question, I guess. We've had many witnesses, and many of us would have pre-existing views that international students are a good thing for our state, not just for our universities, for our culture, for our economy, and our city vibrancy. So let's take it as read that international students are a positive.
No, you broke it up there, sorry.
Let's take it as read that international students are a positive, and one of the key aspects of the proposal is to increase international student numbers. From your perspective and given your broader membership, what other aspects have impacts on international student numbers at the moment? What are the key roadblocks that you see in Australia and potentially South Australia to our international student numbers coming back more quickly?
Well, international students really want to get employability outcomes, and the extent to which the South Australian economy can make good on those employability commitments is a key issue. I guess affordability in terms of student accommodation options, to make sure that they're not ridiculously high rent charges, which is obviously going to be the subject of the Housing National Cabinet meeting later this week in Brisbane. You've also got issues around lifestyle. In Melbourne, some years ago, we had a situation in which Indian students in particular were being physically attacked. That largely came down to the fact that they were working part-time jobs late at night, getting on trains back to their rented accommodation at the end of the railway line where it was cheapest, and they were being exposed, if you like, on public transport to youth gangs, etc. So there's a lot of issues around the location of student accommodation. There's a lot of issues around, if you like, the social licence to operate in the wider community, which I know Study Adelaide's been working on with a number of campaigns as well, so that the community understand the benefits of international students, not just economically but also socially, and that's an initiative that I would hope would continue in Adelaide. But I think we find that compared to certain other states and cities I won't mention, Adelaide and the wider South Australian community have proven themselves to be more willing to welcome and show a duty of care to these young people, perhaps in other parts of our nation. And that's, again, a reputational advantage that Adelaide has over some other cities in certain other state jurisdictions. So I think I congratulate the people of South Australia on their record to date of welcoming international students. I think migration outcomes are also increasingly important for many students. Bear in mind that currently around 84% of international full fee paying students return to their home country after they've graduated. But the federal government have put in place a range of measures, including additional 2-year duration post-study work right visas under the subclass 485, which allows students currently to stay in Australia for 2 to 3 years post-graduation and work in our economy full-time, not necessarily in a job related to the course they've graduated from. And a working group that I was on, set up by Federal Minister Jason Clare, we recommended to the ministers which qualifications for skills in demand in Australia around IT, around allied health, should qualify for an additional 2-year post-study work right visa. So a number of your universities have got courses that are now able to deliver not just a 2 to 3 year post-study work right visa entitlement, but a 5-year post-study work entitlement. And that's going to encourage more international students, to your point, to actually stay in Adelaide to perhaps look for a migration outcome, hopefully, than has been previously available to them. It also means that last week in Sydney, I was at an employer forum that Study New South Wales hosted, and what I said to 120 Sydney-based employers there last week was that the fact that now you know you can employ an international student for 4 or 5 years after they graduate full-time means that you have got some surety, you've got them for probably longer than what a domestic graduate's going to stay with you anyway, given that young people today jump between jobs after 3 or 4 years. So again, that just, I guess, adds to the point that if you've got the right courses, if you've got the right post-study work entitlements, then you're more likely to attract larger numbers of international students, particularly to skills in demand like IT and STEM, where our own young Australian graduates are not really attracted to working science, technology, IT as much as we'd like. And obviously the allied health, be it aged care, nursing, medicine, again, we need more professionals in those areas, and international students are attracted to enrolling and then subsequently working post-study in those professional areas. So, yeah, I think, the national policy framework, which I'm not sure how many of the committee members sitting in the South Australian Parliament are aware of some of these pro-migration, pro-employability federal government policy announcements, including, of course, the increase in migration places from 160,000 to 190,000 that came out of the Jobs and Skills Summit last year. And many of those additional places are for state government nominated migration, which is the main program that international students nominate themselves for state government nominated migration place. So again, to the extent that South Australia is able to negotiate a good quota of state nominated migration places, that would be an attractive proposition to international students thinking of coming to your state to study.
Yeah, can I just ask one supplementary of that? And I'm glad you raised that issue, Mr. Honeywood, and I'll just ask you this one. And if you do pay attention to those national policies, they are very important in the context of what we've discussed today. You've highlighted the things that you think we've done right federally in terms of addressing those issues. I'm just wondering, aside from, the working entitlements changes we've had, do you think that there is still more work to do in terms of more permanent residence placements to meet local job demand, to overcome that brain drain that we keep talking about, that high proportion of people taking that exceptional talent away, and that we, and even one of the issues around the bans on students from certain places. Do you think we're close enough to addressing those issues so that we can really, retain that cream of the crop here and meet our own job demands, as opposed to sending it overseas or whatever the case may be?
Look, it's a great question, and I mean, for 12 years now, I've been having character building conversations with our Home Affairs Department. Our Education Department has primary responsibility for the students once they arrive here, but they don't get in the front door unless our Home Affairs Department issues them with a student visa. And the issue you've raised is that about 4 states in India, unfortunately, it goes back to the Morrison government, if you like, unfortunately, having closed our borders for 2 years. When they reopened our borders, they gifted to corporate Australia uncapped work hours for international students. And there was no consultation with our sector about that. And I've been in the media well quoted about my concerns that it attracted the wrong type of students. So in other words, suddenly we had record numbers of Thai and Vietnamese students and record numbers of Indian students from the Punjab who wanted to come to Australia. Did they want to come to study full time, or did they want to come and work uncapped hours, which the Morrison government, suddenly made available? Now, corporate Australia were grateful because they wanted young people to do the jobs that many young Australians won't do, commercial office cleaning at night, kitchen hand, etc. But there's no doubt in my mind that anecdotally we've, if you like, damaged our reputation because a lot of young people came here. Ironically, they then came under mental health pressure from families back home who said, well, if you can work 3 or 4 jobs and work 100 hours a week in Australia while you are meant to be studying full-time on a student visa, we want you to send Australian dollars back home to the struggling family business. So, you actually have the students complaining themselves to us that this was an unintended consequence of uncapped work hours. So, again, to give credit to the federal government, they took the advice of the working group I was on and put the cap back on work hours from July 1. We made it 24 hours a week or 40 hours a fortnight instead of the previous 20 hours. The argument there was 3 days work, 4 days study, and that seems to be a good balance. So, I think it's going to take us a while to, in answer to your question, to weed out the students that may have come here with the wrong motivation, and we've probably suffered a short-term damage in the meantime. Bear in mind, of course, that we need to diversify as well. We can't rely too much on China and India. But to my point about Home Affairs Department, they've been very adverse to bringing in African students, and yet in the UK for many years, Nigeria has been the number 3 student source market for the UK universities. So there's often barriers to actually getting diversification of student source countries. I think we'd all agree that the more diverse the cohort of international students are, the better, rather than over-reliance on one country or another.
Thank you.
Mr. Haywood, I just want to follow up on some few things that you had to say. You were talking about how South Australia in particular has a very high reliance on recommendations from overseas education agents. I just wanted to ask you, given that, do you feel that the ranking of our universities is particularly important to South Australia?
Look, I don't think I actually said that South Australia's got a higher reliance on education agents. I think I said Australia has a much higher reliance than other study destination countries. So if you just repeat the question.
Sorry, given that Australia has a high reliance on recommendations from international education agents, do you feel that the ranking of our universities is particularly important?
Yes, because students from certain countries, particularly China, for example, are very motivated by the ranking of an institution as to whether they'll choose to go to that institution and therefore that state of Australia, if you like. It's largely because the rankings often help determine them getting a job if they graduate successfully with a large corporation, say back in China, or a large global corporation. I mean, we could all argue the benefits and the legitimacy of rankings. Some universities just seem to chase rankings ad nauseum, but and many of the rankings are based on the number of research papers that are published in the most obscure fields that you and I wouldn't understand. Rankings, rightly or wrongly, have been a key determinant as to why a young person from another country will choose to come to a particular institution. And the fact that Australia has got a number of universities in the top 100 or 200 in the world has also played into overseas government policy. So you're probably aware that the Indonesian government have invited top 100 universities from around the world only to set up campuses in Indonesia. You may or may not be aware of the golden ticket, which is quite amazing, where about 2 years ago, certain cities in China, Shanghai, Beijing, announced that if you successfully graduate from an overseas university in the top 100 according to the Chinese ranking system, then when you come back to China, you are entitled to live in a first-tier city rather than go back and live in your second or third-tier city. And if you have children, your children will have all the rights of education access and job access in a first-tier city like Beijing, Shanghai, whereas normally you'd have to pay a premium to educate them if you weren't originally from a first-tier city in China. So that's called the golden ticket, and universities like Monash, Sydney University, UNSW, University of Melbourne have definitely benefited from a large Chinese student cohort because of the golden ticket incentive, if you like, or inducement. Now, whether the combined Adelaide entity could meet that Chinese ranking would be more of a medium-term situation, I think, rather than short-term.
And also, from you talked before about how you thought that the creation of a new merged university might give Flinders a chance to recalibrate or reorient itself so that it's actually more complementary to the new body, and so it might actually be an advantage to Flinders. Can you just tell us how optimistic you are that the new entity will be able to achieve its stated goal of being a good research university and a good teaching university, and that would you agree that if that can be achieved, that it can only be a good thing for Flinders as well and a good thing for all the universities in South Australia?
Yes, well, I'll be in Adelaide this Thursday and Friday. My national board's meeting in Adelaide on Friday, and I'm going up to Flinders University on Thursday to talk to the senior executive team about a range of issues. And certainly all the feedback I've had from Flinders to date is that they feel that rather than disadvantaging the combined University of South Australia and University of Adelaide institution will allow them to actually, when you say complementary, they would probably say it would allow them to differentiate their product and their mission more and better define how their point of differences are, perhaps. Now, the extent to which Flinders want to focus on research is entirely up to them, but if you're based in the outer suburbs of any city, obviously teaching and learning would be a key priority as part of your mission. So I guess what I'm saying is that I'm confident that the combined entity of UniSA and Adelaide, University of Adelaide would be able to really, if you like, add value to its research effort if it picks the right courses to focus on and the right research areas to focus on. And I can't see any problem for Flinders University if that's the case.
Thank you.
Further questions? Thank you, Mr. Honeywood, for your evidence. It's been most helpful. The transcript of today's proceedings will be made available shortly.
Thank you.